Another edition of Outside Shots, the Final Four edition, presented by, as always, thelines.com. You can follow The Lines on Twitter at TheLinesUS, and you can follow me on Twitter at Eli Hershkovich. I'll introduce my guest to the right virtually in just a moment here. But before we get started, as always, remember to give the video a thumbs up and ring that bell to get notifications whenever The Lines releases a new sports betting video on any market, including March Madness and Final Four. One more or two more to go after today. Going to record another with this very guest on Sunday afternoon, actually. So be on the lookout for that in preparation of the national championship game. TheLines.com is giving away another $250 in Amazon gift cards in our March Madness Pick'em contest for the Final Four. For more details, head over to play.thelines.com and join the Lines Discord betting channel to get notifications whenever we release bets on March Madness Final Four, including what I had last week, San Diego State semi-regional futures before the Alabama game. Cash that at around plus 650. Not bragging, though, because I also had an Arkansas regional ticket that got trucked in the Sweet 16 against the Huskies that we'll be breaking down in one of the national semifinals games. But now introducing my co-host that I've been doing this show with during March Madness, Justin Perri. You can follow him on Twitter at JustinPerri8, the betting product and content lead over at ShotQuality. What's going on today, Justin?
Hey, Eli. Thanks for having me back again. It has been a good time to be here breaking down a few of these weekends, getting to wrap up the college basketball season. Always a little bit of a sad time for us over at SQ when things start to wind down, but it has been a really great time. We're all really excited for what's going on in Houston. We have some ShotQuality team members actually at the Final Four, so kind of jealous, but really excited to be here and break down the games and hopefully catch a few tickets.
No Armando Bacot ankles to be checked out like last year after the Duke game. I remember I was making a joke on Twitter. I was around the UNC bus trying to see what the situation was like before UNC took on Kansas in the title game. So no notable injuries to note for either of these national semifinal matchups. But just a quick run through of how we're going to go about things today. We'll break down FAU San Diego State and UConn Miami before giving out some projected lines and totals potentially for myself and what Justin and the team, the ShotQuality team, have over with their respective projections for some potential national championship matchups. But let's start digging in, man. Let's break down San Diego State and FAU first. Aztecs were sitting around -1.5, -2 pretty much across the board before One Sharp sports betting group ticked this up to all the way up to -3.5 actually in favor of the Aztecs before the steam came down a little bit this afternoon as we're recording on Thursday. SDSU sitting pretty much at -3 across the board, some -2.5s as well out there, and the total, as I pull it up here, is 131.5, which has not changed very much. Before we get into some of the matchup specific stuff, San Diego State, I'm curious if this plays a role into your handicap at all of the total, just in general, when it comes to handicapping Final Four matchups, because you have more so of a shooting backdrop than you get at some of these regional sites for the matchups previously in the NCAA tournament. San Diego State has now hit 12 consecutive unders. And I am not somebody that hits on trends in terms of actually playing the number, but it's notable because this Aztecs defense is elite. They have allowed a flat 17% three-point clip so far in the tournament, which is pretty unbelievable. And I'll dive into that a little bit. I'm sure you will as well. But in general, when it boils down to Final Four totals, does handicapping, does projecting maybe towards unders or teams underperforming shooting-wise factor into your handicap at all?
Yeah, it's really tough with a team like San Diego State, right? Because they bring such a lockdown defense, especially on the perimeter, to every game they play in. You know it's going to be probably the crux of this game. FAU shoots so heavily from behind the arc. I believe like one of like 35th in the nation in frequency from three. So that's really what this game feels like.
Top
It's going to
25.
Oh, is it? Is it? I think we could be a little bit off. And when I took that number, that's on me. But yeah, no, one of the top teams in terms of being in that like upper echelon in frequency, right? Like they just will attack you with the three. They go for the most valuable shots. They rank in the top in terms of three and rim rate as well for us at ShotQuality. I think that, in terms of what San Diego State's going to bring, it's tough, honestly, to say that a team's going to just continue to underperform. I think Alabama expected to score like 18 more points from three if they had shot their expected numbers against the San Diego State team. But you get to this point where, and I think we've talked about it in past episodes, Eli, you have to maybe just say like, this is a team where you are almost expected to underperform. That's how often it happens. It's no longer just like teams should get to their average. This team is probably going to force you to shoot under your average, take worse looks. So I do tend to think that's pretty heavily factored in. The real issue for me is that if this game is close, you could see it really turn into like a rock fight, right? Like really moving slow, a couple bad shots, some shot clock violations on either side. This feels like defense could be the focus between both teams instead of it being just like this back and forth offensive battle. I don't think either team's going to be opposed to it. And if it does come down to like a couple possessions at the end, you could see everything get very drawn out.
Pace is also going to matter a lot because San Diego State they rank just outside of average in terms of average possession length across Division I. FAU is top 100 in that category. So the Owls want to play more up-tempo than San Diego State, certainly. Yeah. Now, the Aztecs will push the floor a little bit off of those turnovers, and they do force a top 110 opponent's turnover rate. But tempo is going to matter a whole lot when it comes to the total, especially maybe to Justin's point, if you're looking at a first half under or first half over bet rather than trying to take full game under just because of the nature of fouling down the stretch if the final score is just as tight as the spread indicates. But going back and looking at some more historical context here, I wrote about this in my betting guide over at thelines.com. And to your point, because we did hit on this when it came to previous teams that made deep NCAA tournament runs. And like you said, the expectation of their opponent's results in the tournament, maybe adjusting to those outcomes and the variance, the regression, not necessarily occurring like you would naturally expect when it came to maybe a key situational spot during the regular season off of a 5-game win streak or when a key player comes back or the matchup dictates that. Because like I mentioned, San Diego State's defense, like you said, has been elite so far in the tournament. But overall, per ShotQuality, they also have allowed the 8th lowest open three-point attempt rate across college basketball. And then you look at North Carolina, because this was the very example we brought up on our preview podcast when the bracket came out on Sunday night, going back to Selection Sunday. North Carolina, up until that national championship game last year against Kansas, allowed a 25.8% three-point clip to the opposition. And they actually allowed or ranked just outside number 196 across college basketball, to be exact, in open three-point rate. So unlike San Diego State, they allowed an above average or below average, from their perspective, opponent's three-point rate, depending on how you look at that statistic. So North Carolina got some shooting luck from their opponents, or at least the matchups dictated those struggles, or again, depending on how you want to gauge it, their success in that respective category. So just because FAU has a top 25 three-point scoring rate, like you also hit on in your mini breakdown there, San Diego State's three-point defense needs to be accounted for in terms of this matchup, and especially if they wind up controlling the pace. Because unless FAU is zipping up and down the floor with Jonell Davis and Elijah Martin, if those turnovers are coming into play like we saw against Kansas State, because FAU, which traditionally is not a turnover-heavy team, racked up 22 turnovers against the Wildcats. And statistically, Kansas State's ball pressure has been much more effective than San Diego State's. And the Aztecs have a very good pressure defense in their own right, especially on the perimeter.
Yeah.
So I would expect FAU, I'm not saying they're not going to shoot maybe closer to 30% than they were shooting before the Elite Eight matchup when they got some positive regression against the Wildcats in the Elite Eight. But I do think the Aztecs' 3-point perimeter defense holds up more than not in this Final Four matchup.
For sure. And, I think Kansas State also is a little bit more prone to those turnovers, rank a lot worse in our standings than this SDSU team in terms of keeping that ball safe. And we saw it. I mean, the guards that FAU have are ferocious. They know how to cut into those passing lanes. They're going to make you pay for it with live ball turnovers. Excuse me. But yeah, I think this is just a different beast for them. SDSU plays a very it feels like an efficient game. And I saw a stat out there that was about how when, SDSU scores efficiently in terms of having more than I think it was 1.03 points per game. I'm not sure if you saw that stat floating around, Eli, but they're really dominant in terms of when they get above a certain offensive threshold, the defense is so consistent that they naturally tend to win. But if they are below 1 point per possession, I think it might have been 0.94, they tend to actually be stuck in games and have to fight for their victory a little bit more. So this is really going to come down to how San Diego State is able to operate against that FAU defense and what FAU does to stop San Diego State, because there's very little question to me about San Diego State's defense interrupting what FAU is going to try to do. They are good at stopping the three. They are great at some of these off the dribble 3-pointers that the guards for FAU tend to rely on a little bit. But
that's especially notable there, off the dribble 3-point defense, to your point. Now, I do kind of want to jump in there because San Diego State's depth is such an important factor when it not only comes to that particular area on shot quality that you noted, off the dribble 3-point defense, or at least points per possession shot quality wise, but FAU also ranks top 15 when it boils down to bench minutes. So they kind of even each other out in that regard when it comes to how well Dutcher, or at least how well San Diego State's depth has played so far, or played out so far in the tournament when it comes down to wearing down the opposition, like we saw against Alabama, like we saw against Creighton, which predominantly before that game, when they played a little more Sharif Mitchell, or McDermott used Sharif Mitchell more than he had in their previous 3 matchups. And that also had to do with Mason Miller going down in the first game against North Carolina State. But San Diego State's depth played a big role in Creighton's 3-point struggles, going 2 of 17 against San Diego State. I don't think it necessarily mattered as much against Alabama because they were running Brandon Miller off the 3-point line. Right. And then conversely, when it does play out like this and San Diego State keeps this more of a half-court game and the depth does negate each other out for both teams, if FAU is run off the 3-point line and they try to attack you off the dribble, which John L. Davis is very good at, especially when it comes to drawing fouls, which can be a bit of an issue for San Diego State, limiting their foul trouble, even though they do have that depth. Like I mentioned, their length inside can be very disruptive, and they do have a size advantage, a very physical front court led by one of the best defensive bigs in college basketball, Nathan Mensah. And it is cool, nugget-wise, that Mensah was on that 2020 San Diego State team that the COVID year, COVID-19 disrupted the Aztecs to have a potential number 1 seed, and now he's in the Final Four. I believe the only player remaining, besides obviously the coaching staff led by Brian Dutcher, who was a former longtime Steve Fisher assistant. So all the historical stuff for San Diego State makes for a fun conversation in itself. But the Aztecs defensively, inside and out, if this game is played more in the half court, which definitely plays more towards the under and plays more to San Diego State's advantage when it comes to the spread, even though the line spiked up a bit because of the nugget that we brought up initially to start off this breakdown. All those factors make me lean towards the Aztecs, but I project this thing at around San Diego State -2, -2.5. So not really an edge for me, especially at this point.
ShotQuality really likes San Diego State, and I think, our model is pretty notoriously stubborn, for the lack of a better word. We do not, we like, champion our model's ability to not overreact to recent play, but in tournaments that can lead to it feeling a little bit slow to adapt to how good a team like FAU has been. And that's sort of what you're seeing here. We are going to expect that in, the 10,000 simulations run over and over again, the expected I'm choking on my words today. Sorry. The
It's been a long month.
Yeah, it is a long month, man. The expected score for this one based on shot quality is going to be 70.9 to 62.5. So we have it right there at around 133 on the total, and we're going to be pretty confident in San Diego State to advance here. We laid -1.5 and -2 officially. We would be pretty happy with -2.5 too, not really against the market movement, understand it. We do think that, if this game is played as expected, we should see San Diego State, but, worth noting that FAU really hasn't played as expected in a couple games. So it's all about balancing expectations versus reality. And it's just nice, in our opinion, to have that data point to compare with.
I'm curious because Darian Trammell has been the key or one of the huge factors. I mean, you go back to the Alabama game, igniting that Aztecs run when they were down by 9 points, and Alabama made their initial run, their initial quote unquote comeback in the second half after trailing by 5, I believe, at the break. And then also gave them the lead, which I don't think the Aztecs relinquished, although Creighton tied it a couple times for sure, but the Blue Jays never officially grabbed the lead back after Trammell's floater gave San Diego State the edge, a 1-point edge granted, but still a 1-point quote unquote cushion with about 5 to 6 minutes to go. But it felt like a cushion considering the way that game was unfolding, with Creighton looking like they were going to pull away a couple times. But like we've hit on a ton, San Diego State's defense is another monster, the 4th rated adjusted defensive efficiency per KenPom. Curious too, before we get into the second matchup here, second of the two, and maybe the more intriguing game when it comes to the Final Four matchups. Although I'm not one of those people that really cares, man. Like, I enjoy San Diego State FAU. We're college basketball junkies. As long as the game has a spread, has a total, has a money line, has props, doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I've bet on Missouri Valley State this season, so I'll take whatever I can get, and you're definitely not going to find me clamoring for the blue bloods. And I think this is a beautiful example of where college basketball is going, and really exemplifies how special it is that there are 360 plus teams for people to know in order to properly understand this sport. And that's why it's almost impossible to get a bracket. You have 68 teams in the field, and anybody can win a basketball game. Like, there is no such thing as a 100% game in this sport. The biggest favorites still give 20% to the other side. Like, it's because it's college kids and anything can happen. And we've seen 15-point runs. We saw Miami, who we're about to talk about. They were like 10-1 to win that game against Texas at a point. And I would know because I put like 0.3 units on them because I had a Texas future, and I was like, what the heck? I'll play a little hedge. But no, anything can happen in the sport, and it's really hard to handicap. And I think FAU being here is awesome. I love this for Coach Dusty May. I can't wait to see what it continues to inspire in this sport.
And to your point too, what you just brought up in terms of the variance of the NCAA tournament as a whole, this Final Four marks the first time in the seeding era. So I believe that goes back to 85. Not only will it be the first time, or is it the first time, that there are no number 1 seeds, or at least in the Elite 8, there were no number 1 seeds remaining for the first time in tournament seeding history. But it marks the first time as well in the seeding era that there are 3 or more teams that were listed with preseason odds of 50-1 entering November. So you go back to where we're sitting, where all these teams were priced at in the futures market. San Diego State around 125-1. I believe it's Caesars. Miami somewhere in the 80-1 range. UConn 60-80, maybe as low as 50, but I feel like that was closer to the peak 85. And then FAU in the ballpark of 2,500, not 25, not 250-1, but 2,500 to 1 to win it all. So wild stuff when you look back at what has ensued. But we've both been on the money when it comes to not only our futures bets or positions, Justin, but also the notion that this is the most wide open field breaking down the NCAA tournament collectively since 2014, or if you don't want to say 9 years ago, then 2011 for sure.
It's awesome.
It is awesome.
I love it. I love it. I think, if you're here with us, rocking with us, talking about like things like shot quality, expected metrics, Ken Pom, I think probably understand like the statistical beauty in what we see every time these players play. It's impossible at some level to predict every single game correctly. Like, you aren't really out here playing the game if you haven't had a game that you look at and you're like, I was totally, geez, it's a rough day for me. Totally wrong on that one. And it happens all the time. You got to be ready for it. You got to have like that memory of a goldfish when you're trying to make predictions about a high variance sport, and just move on to the next one.
Really quickly here, because this is the more headlining matchup with a theoretical blue blood. I know that's kind of gone back and forth too with UConn, but 3 national championships since 1999, I think suffices as a blue blood. What have you been up to this week? Because it's been a lighter week prep-wise. I, for the first time yesterday, watched 2 episodes of Ted Lasso with my girlfriend and drank a couple high noons. So pretty much the American tradition at this point. What were you up to this week with a little more free time?
I mean, a little more free time on my hands. I haven't watched the most recent Ted Lasso episode, so don't spoil it just yet. But no, catching up on a little bit of TV, seeing some friends that I haven't seen since the end of January, really, with all the ShotQuality product launches and all that cool stuff we've been doing. But also, I'm pretty much right into baseball season. I'm a big Yankee fan. First hit of the entire season was a Judge home run, so hopefully it should be a good one for the Yanks.
I hate you.
A little fingers crossed. It's been a funny couple of years as a Yankee fan, just always setting up for high hopes and realistic disappointment. But this is our year. I don't know. I love the same type of stuff with baseball. Honestly, Eli, I look into expected numbers, not really, getting too much into picking a lot of favorites or run lines. I play a lot of pitcher props, and I use some of the air density stuff and get into visual memory to try to understand where players and pitchers are going to be in positions for us to find value. So it's a fun time and sort of just a summer hobby now, because the focus is going to be NBA and right back into college really quick.
Yeah, no question. Mo Nuara, by the way, one of our lead writers over at thelines.com, does a fantastic job when it comes to betting on MLB. Ooh, and nice. He's got a lot of write-ups over at thelines.com, a 2,000, 3,000 word piece on win totals. We just did a video on that yesterday. And to your point, too, when it comes to baseball metrics, right there with you. A couple of long shot picks for me. I have one long shot bet on an AL Cy Young candidate. Right up on that over at thelines.com, although Garrett Cole might have taken some steam out of that pick today with his performance.
And he never even pitches well in the cold weather. So I was really impressed. If Cole's in that form, it might be, again, good season for my Yanks. Fingers crossed.
Second time I'm going to swear on the Outside Shots podcast. Fuck your New York Yankees. All right, over to the other semifinal game. I'm sure people hate the baseball conversation, especially when it comes to the Yankees. I'm just giving you a hard time there.
It's fair. We deserve it. I'm not against it.
UConn and Miami. This line has not fluctuated, unlike FAU and San Diego State. UConn has been predominantly a 5.5 point favorite, maybe a little bit of VIG, depending on the book, but sitting minus 5.5 across the board. Total is at 149, 149.5. Depending on the book. So where are you sitting at with UConn, Miami, shot quality wise, Justin? And just for context here, I know some bettors and people in the Lines Discord are riding with me. I have a couple of UConn futures, some lower limit bets at 80-1, but predominantly UConn was filled up in my futures portfolio at 50-1. So any long, nice ticket. Any long-term stake for you here with this game, or how are you gauging it just single game wise?
No long-term plays for me right now. Unfortunately, my 2 big long-term tickets were Tennessee and Texas. So I got some decent hedge money.
You were at the Tennessee game, FAU. So you were at the Garden. What was that emotion like?
You could feel it. You could feel like the air getting like pulled out of the lungs of that Tennessee team, just unable to get points up. The momentum was shifting. Everybody could feel it. The FAU fans were going nuts, had incredible representation. Honestly, they were going crazy. It was crazy to just feel that tide shift and to watch John L. Davis get big clutch bucket after clutch bucket, hitting big free throws. The whole place was going wild. Honestly, it was a blur, especially after the Kansas State game and with Michigan State too. That one was crazy. Watching Noel put up 19 assists, some awesome dunks. So I barely even I had to sit there and think about what I saw because it was such a crazy experience. But yeah, I don't know. This it's an interesting one here. I did at least get the hedge with when I saw FAU steaming back. I was like, all right, I got to put a little money on plus 180 here. Got it down, but yeah, my long-term bets are gone, which is okay. Again, we definitely got some profit out of them, which I'll consider a win. For this UConn game though, I honestly, we do see them winning. We have it 71.4 to 67.1. So if you're doing the quick math at home, that 149.5 total is where we are going to be setting our sights over at ShotQuality. Going to be going in for an underplay here. We like the defense to do some work in terms of finally getting a team that might be able to limit what Miami has done, especially on the boards. UConn's pretty nasty when it comes to rebounding. One of the top teams. We've seen it be a major reason why they've been able to win some of the games in the fashion that they have, just limiting opponent possessions. I don't think
second highest offensive rebounding rate too, so that allows them to control the pace.
Yeah, exactly. So following up buckets, getting points, never really doing much worse than trading buckets, it seems, for UConn. Even when they were losing to Pitino and the Gales at the half, you knew that they were going to come out and figure out a way to stop their opposition and then reliably get buckets. Miami, we probably at ShotQuality feel like the 3-point defense might be a little bit of a problem against this UConn team that has clearly shown they can get hot, that they are hot. They've been outperforming expectations, but reliably. So it's always that battle between, all right, expected scores might be lower if they were to shoot their average, but they haven't been shooting their averages at all. They are, locked in, hitting their shots. I think that, Miami's offense is scary for an under right now. They've gone to 80, 85, 90 points, it seems like, in every of their last 3 or 4 games. But this UConn team is just a different beast. I could see it really slowing down late as UConn kind of clamps it up. That's how I see it going. I like UConn a lot. I mean, I know they have a lot of market love too. Currently betting favorites, I can get the lay a price for them to win the tournament right now.
Odds on favorite at this point.
Crazy to have that in the Final Four, but that's just the respect they're commanding. Their performance has been elite. And yeah, I think it's a fair thing to say that they should win the tournament right now, just based on what the profiles of these teams are on paper. But of course, the game's not played on paper. But yeah, I like this one to slow down. I think 150 is a little bit high. And I think you're in a good spot to take it under because of the scores that have been coming in on Miami. Always good to think that betting results in the way I play, I don't know if you're always standardized unit plays, but when you do play the same unit every time, it's a pretty binary result, right? Your losses have the same price every time. Your wins have the same price every time, assuming, playing minus 110, pretty available in college basketball.
No, and going back to what we brought up at the tail end of last week's Sweet 16 podcast, that's really important when it comes to bankroll management too.
Yeah, but the nice thing is that the way that we kind of like to approach it is even if it does go over by 56, it won't go over 50 points, but if it goes over by 20 points, right, and it gets to 170, the thing is that we just see that such a larger side of this distribution coming in under the line. There are obviously cases where it could go well past it. But, more likely than not, we feel pretty secure putting our foot down and saying this is somewhere you should put a wager. Again, coming in closer to 140 for us. I think it could really slow down and just be a little bit of a different battle. Miami isn't going to be forced into this sort of last ditch hope type of playing that they had against Texas, where they have to hit these threes, come back, foul, missed free throws. all this stuff sort of had to happen, and the game really got slowed down. I think you could honestly see a UConn chokehold type of result where, it's just like at the end of the game, it's like UConn draining clock, Miami still not able to get anything against the defense.
Backdoor cover.
Right.
Waiting to happen.
I know. My favorite side here, honestly, of the 4 units on the floor, though, is going to be the UConn defense. So that's why I feel pretty comfortable with the under, and I feel comfortable with UConn advancing. I don't know how I feel about laying it in terms of the points. It's probably a pretty big price on the money line, but if you want to bet on UConn, I would probably stay away from laying the 4 or 5 right now.
Good stuff there. And in the midst of that, you brought up a little historical context when it came, or just with UConn being overvalued in the market. To your eye, and I kind of agree, just a tad, I make this game somewhere around UConn minus 4.9. So a little bit less than a point, minimal. I don't plan on hedging my UConn future. I wouldn't bet on Miami regardless, just because it's not a big enough edge in regards to the market itself, at least right now, unless this gets bumped up closer to tip, which could happen. We see that from time to time, especially with public favorites. And UConn has been backed by both sharp bettors for sure. Not the sharp betting group that we saw earlier today with San Diego State, but still very much so along with the betting public, just because of their utter dominance. And you look at how they've completely blitzkrieg through this tournament, an average margin of victory of 22.5 points through their 4 games in the West region.
Crazy.
So far. Yeah. Insane, but also not insane considering how they steamroll through non-conference play when you go back to November and December. But just going back into history a little bit, and I use North Carolina as an example in comparison to San Diego State's defense. This historical example relates to Miami, and maybe there being a little bit of value, or at least perceptionally looking at Miami a little differently than maybe on the surface you would traditionally do so, because of how dominant UConn's defense has been, to your point. So getting into it here, Miami and the 2019 Auburn Tigers is where I'd like to start. Ooh. Because you go back and you look at the results, and I have this on a table over at thelines.com if you want to see it visually in my monster mega Final Four betting preview right up. If you go back to Miami in or if you go back to Auburn in 2019 and their results, they just hung on to a victory against New Mexico State in the first round. And Miami, although they did cover against Drake in their first round matchup, or backdoor cover, I should say, which I know hurt some Bulldogs backers for sure. But they also, that was, Drake going scoreless in the final 5 to 6 minutes of that game. And the rest of the results kind of speak for themselves in terms of how eerily similar both of their profiles were outcome-wise over their first 4 games in the tournament. And then you also factor in that both teams were about even when it came to total rebounds on the glass at both ends of the floor, along with their defense, which allowed a 45% clip from the field entering the tournament. Now, that's, again, it's kind of similar to the notion that I mentioned with San Diego State. You do not want to say that a trend matters when you're comparing 2 teams or over the course of a 12 to 15 game sample size. That's not the point I'm trying to make. What I am saying is that UConn, similar to Auburn's matchup with Virginia in the Final Four, because that spread is very similar as well. Auburn was a 6-point dog to UVA. That line got steamed up a little bit closer to tip. Right. And Miami, a 5.5-point dog against UConn, which is a public darling. Although UVA didn't steamroll through their opponents in the tournament, they backdoor covered in their own right against Purdue in that 2019 Elite Eight in overtime. But it's very similar to the standpoint of, okay, you have a team in Miami that could be perceived a little bit lucky to get here. Auburn, you can make the same case, especially after that first round comeback or them just clinging on to that 1-point victory with New Mexico State's I forget who even it was, their guard missing 2 or 3 free throws from the line in the final seconds of that game. Wild. I don't know if you were on anything in that first round matchup, 5-12.
I don't know that I was, honestly, but the profiles definitely are so interesting, right? Like to sort of feel like these teams, I may say these because I'm already including FAU, right? Like there's just like both these teams are just here on a run that have come off of some close wins. And I think you see that a lot. It's very energizing. It can bring a lot of momentum to a team to like, eke out a close win and move on with like, that like really battle worn, like we can accomplish anything, we can weather the storm type of mentality. And I mean, you're Miami coming off of a win against Texas in the fashion that you did. You should feel that way. I mean, that is supposed to be one of the best defensive teams in the nation.
Very experienced guards too.
Yeah. I mean, they have really great guards, and it's proven time and time again in this tournament that is really what can set you apart, because usually that just comes with shot creation, right? Like good guards go hand in hand with like, creating not only off the dribble but off the pass, opening up other teammates, I guess handling spacing and gravity and, organizing the floor to find value in terms of getting guys their looks. And you need that like general on the floor who can execute a good coach's plan. And I think that's what Miami has really been able to do, is like they have guys who know what they're supposed to be doing out there, are reliable at doing it, good hands, good passing. And then the bigs just have the touch around the rim, the finishing, and the size, honestly, to get it done. So I do think this is going to be Connecticut's biggest challenge. I mean, they haven't had a game stay within 15 points yet, right? I think that was the St. Mary's game, was the lowest margin of victory at 15 for them.
Yep.
I would be shocked if this one gets past 15. That feels like my safe bet. I know it's probably like minus 500, Miami plus 15 or something, but like with this UConn team, that is something that probably shouldn't be priced that way. There's
Justin advocating for a monster lay on the alt spread on the Kings.
I'm not advocating for the lay necessarily. I wouldn't put money down on it, but this seems like it's got to be
maybe a live play.
Which what?
Maybe a live play.
Yeah, maybe. Look, I think there's definitely going to be a point where, especially if you're holding a UConn future, which I'm sure plenty of the listeners are, if there's going to be a mathematical point where if you get like 10-1, 12-1 on Miami because UConn's on a ridiculous run and Miami's down 15 with like 12 to go in the second half. I feel like you get to that point where it's mathematically like, all right, I can put down like half a unit and potentially walk away with like 6 units or something. And you have like a 50-1. I don't know where the math would perfectly line up, but that's where I start to be like, okay, at 14, 15-1, if UConn's really up, the craziest things we've ever seen have happened in this sport. So I wouldn't be super against like a little sprinkle, just so that if the crazy stuff happens, you're not sitting there with your hands in your head when it's all said and done. It's like it is an emotional game, right? And it's not easy to sit there and say, oh yeah, I'm emotionless about betting. Like only it takes a real sicko to like fully take emotion out of it. And I think it's a talent and it's a skill and it's learned over time, but you want to emotionally prepare yourself for, situations so you're not like driving around like upset about your 51 ticket. You could have had a little bit of value. It was 15-1, man. Like I should have put down $10. I would have had at least a little from that. Awesome. Like we've all been there. I've learned my lesson. So yeah,
I get it. I think you're right. It's not only a long-term, and it's a good conversation for another podcast. Maybe we'll save it for off-season mental relaxation when it comes to it. It is important, but it's a process in itself when it comes to deciding on how to hedge and being comfortable with or with not hedging on your futures bet, or just on a bet in general if you do get that money line price in game, because I typically don't hedge. Last week I had San Diego State, like I mentioned from the get-go on this podcast, at plus 650, not a massive number by any means, but going back to the regional semifinal against Alabama, I bet the Aztecs to come out of the South region. And you could have made the case that in the wanting seconds or wanting minute of that Creighton game, Elite Eight, that maybe I put a couple bucks down on the Jays. But for me, and it had nothing to do with the money, I typically never hedge.
That's fair.
And
Look,
I did hedge a little bit on my Texas Tech ticket, I will say, going back to the 2019 title game. That was 100-1, but we're also not at the title game yet. I think I would hedge a little bit, especially if UConn goes up against San Diego State. Now, that might surprise people, and we'll get to our projected spreads in a little bit here after I have a couple more nuggets on UConn Miami. But listen, it goes both ways. I'm not saying your strategy is incorrect at all. I'm just saying the way I approach futures at this point, Final Four, I typically don't hedge.
That's fair. That's fair. Again, you probably, are giving yourself the best mathematical, like long-term view by not hedging, right? Like you view them as, positional lottery tickets, trying to get yourself the one that over time and playing that strategy the right way, you will eventually get yourself a winner, right? And it's true. You get the value, you're going to get yourself a good chance. The other side of it is sometimes you want to feel like you got a little bit out of it, right? And even if it's just that 1 unit back to keep yourself feeling a little sane, you don't want to lose money on a 50-1 that you brought to the Final Four. Like it's all, like it's all personal, right? It's all people will ask all the time, like, hey, should I hedge this? And I'm like, okay, well, I got to ask you like the 10 questions about like your finational situation and how much.
Here are the 10 commandments,
right? It's just like
hedging.
It's individual. It is, and there's no like perfectly right way to bet for every single person. Like you get to develop your own strategy that keeps you in the game, that helps you win. That's the beauty of it. And, we all get to experience each other's methodologies to try to fine tune our own. I've learned a lot from people in this community, and I hope a few have learned a few things from what comes out of my mouth. So,
well, what I did learn from your initial points about UConn and Miami is you're one of those unit pros, because you said unit about 5 or 6 times. No, I'm just messing around. It is a good way to contextualize it, because that there are people, and it doesn't matter even how much you bet when it comes, whether it's 3 figures, $100, or 5 figures, 10 grand. Unit shaming when it comes to the actual dollar amount is a big thing in the Twitterverse, or gambling Twitter, in the negative side, I would say, of the gambling Twitter space. So I definitely don't blame you for taking that approach. But going back to UConn's defense here, a couple more points, and then if you want to rally off anything else before we get to our championship game projections for the 4 potential matchups. Like you said, if this game is played in the half court, definitely favors UConn. UConn limits threes exponentially. They were top 5 among teams entering the tournament when it came to opponents' 3-point attempts per game allowed. Miami, granted, they rank, I want to say, bottom 110, bottom 120 in 3-point attempt rate, but they do have a top 43-point efficiency across college basketball. We brought up the Canes guards, very experienced. Similar to that Auburn team with Bryce Brown and Jared Harper, you have Isaiah Wong, who was on last year's Canes Elite 8 team. Nigel Pack, who is an experienced guard, even though he just joined Miami off of that monster NIL deal. Shout out to Pack getting paid, literally in the offseason. And Jordan Miller, Poplar, who I think has been there for a stretch too, and Omir, who is a very experienced big, and honestly very underappreciated when it comes to finishing against more sizable bigs in terms of the opposition. Whether it's Adama Sanogo, I don't know, that might be a tough matchup against Donovan Clingan, but at least Sanogo, I think he might have a little bit of success in the half court, or at least when it comes to his points prop, I think he's sitting at around 11 and a half. And the other thing to note too with Sanogo, just overall, this isn't any sort of a joke, and whether it comes to the individual himself, or when we're bringing this up contextually in terms of his potential performance against Miami. Adama Sanogo is, going to be celebrating, or has been celebrating, Ramadan throughout March Madness, or at least over the last couple weeks. And Ramadan, I believe, officially ends at sundown, which is theoretically a couple hours before this game tips off. And it should actually be a little bit later after that in terms of the actual game time, because this game, the second leg of the national semifinals, will typically get pushed back because especially if San Diego State and FAU is close, like the point spread indicates, although ShotQuality projects a little bit more of a San Diego State getting a more comfortable win in that regard. But I do just want to say, playing devil's advocate to everything we've noted for UConn, dominant on the glass, dominant interior defense, and Miami wants to get to the rim in the half court. Although they might have a little bit of advantage in the mid-range, a much better mid-range shooting team, even though Arkansas relied on it much more so than it does with any other attribute when it comes to their profile in the half court. Miami can score in half court and is more efficient in that regard, whether it's with Isaiah Wong or Nigel Pack off the dribble. But UConn turnovers has yet to be exploited yet in the tournament. And this is something I touched on with John Murray on my podcast earlier in the week when we were breaking down the Final Four, very surface level, just because it was so early in the week. But UConn ranks, I want to pull it up here because I broke it down in my Final Four piece, bottom 135 across college basketball in turnover rate. And we've yet to see that get exploited. I believe the only team that did it on paper was St. Mary's, but just because of how good UConn's offense efficiency-wise was in transition in the second half against the Gales, didn't really come into play in terms of that game being closer on the box score for the final score result. If Miami can force turnovers, and they forced the fifth highest turnover percentage in ACC play, Isaiah Wong will get after it, Poplar especially in that category, then to your point, a team that hasn't faced adversity yet, we don't know how they're going to react when it comes to their mental game state. But for Miami to have a chance to cover this game, if it's not on a backdoor cover, they've got to speed up the tempo a little bit, especially off of those live ball turnovers.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying with the turnovers is really key. Miami's transition is actually really efficient. I think that's one of the best chances they have to get some easy buckets and keep Connecticut from running away on them, right? And it might be creative off of misses, it might be creative off of steals, but I think they got to try to shoot in the beginning of the shot clock if they want to have any success. And maybe it's my play on the under that lets you know that I don't think they're gonna. I think it's gonna be really tough. But if they are going to be successful, my cat is kicking my camera as I try to talk. If they are going to be successful in this game, that's what it's really going to look like to me. Like, it's going to be efficient transition plays, getting easy looks at the rim off of broken plays, off of, long rebounds, just being ready to sort of run, not necessarily crashing the defensive glass, taking a couple risks, trying to leak out. Like, that's what you're going to need to do against this UConn team to keep their defense kind of honest, right? Because if they're crashing the offensive boards, you're in big trouble, right? If they don't feel like there's a risk there and they can just, send everybody at the offensive glass and you're not pulling down those rebounds and not making them pay for it, it could get ugly and out of hand quickly if they're converting second half points and, not having many possessions end with a 0. And that's just, it's simple, right? I feel like a bowling coach, like, get out there and stop them from scoring. But it's kind of the truth. Like, it is really going to come down to like Miami generating easy looks from defense. If UConn tends to get what they want, it's going to be hard for anybody to just match them because their defense is also really good. While, Miami maybe has a little bit to worry about, especially with their 3-point shooting defense. That's really going to have to take a step up in my opinion as well.
I was doing a little breakdown on this. I don't think I'll have a play on it, but the most outstanding player, I mean, there's so much variance too, especially when it comes to 80-year-old farts voting on the award to begin with, and narratives and when the vote needs to be submitted. I did a whole breakdown of this over at thelines.com earlier in the week. But Andre Jackson is an interesting case study. And going back to my point about turnovers, because I think you can make the case among the bets on the board and how UConn is priced into the title market. Like we had on earlier, the odds on favorite, Adama Sanogo, Jordan Hawkins, I believe, tied for the shortest MOP odds and not really playable at that number. Their numbers, even though Sanogo could be in for a big game against an undersized Miami front court, depending on how Omier fares and whether his ability to efficiently rebound and score down low against bigger front court so far in the tournament translates to a more physical Huskies front court overall, with especially with a 7-foot guy off the bench and Klingon, who's been dominant in that regard when he comes in and spells Sanogo. But Jackson's turnover rate has been his big bugaboo. And I would say this is what I wrote about in the article. 16-1, if I was to bet anybody in the most outstanding player award market, it would be Jackson at that price, especially with the notion that UConn should win the national championship for all the reasons that we hit on. Doesn't mean that we'll feel the same way going into the title game itself, depending on the matchup, or doesn't mean that we won't find value in the other side if UConn gets steamed up yet again and the Huskies blow out the Canes. But Jackson as a variable in his own right. The guy can be such an unreliable facet because he can be that playmaker like we saw at the end of the half against Gonzaga when it comes to making those distinguishable passes to Caravan where he literally steals a turnover away from the Bulldogs and then gives UConn a 3-point or a 3-possession lead going into halftime. Yet he could turn the ball over a lot against Miami's ball pressure. So the guy makes a big difference one way or the other for the Huskies against a pressure-oriented Miami defense. That's for sure.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be really interesting to see. Definitely an X factor. And I think that honestly, when it comes down to how those potential final matchups could look like, I think, when you get to the 3-point shooters for UConn, it feels like, someone is going to need to have a type of heroic performance to outduel either FAU or San Diego State, whichever one UConn would eventually meet. I think is going to come down to some guard play, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't know. I think, I'm not so much into, I don't have any futures on player props right now for MOP, honestly, but I would tend to agree with you. I think, that gives betting UConn players seems like the right way to go, unless you really like FAU and like maybe John L. Davis to continue to put the tournament on his back is one that I don't hate instead of taking FAU. But yeah, it's a really interesting market. Not my biggest forte though.
Before we get into our projections, or actually, before we get into our projections for the potential national championship game matchups, if in terms of bets overall, I know you mentioned you like the over in San Diego State FAU, and then also, or San Diego State, I should say.
Yeah, I like San Diego State.
You guys like San Diego State per shot quality against the number even after the steam today, and then you're looking at the under for UConn Miami. Is that it so far?
That's it so far. Yeah, I don't have much of a side on UConn. We're right there at like 4 or 5, and then the total we have for San Diego State is pretty on the money as well. So just going to take, the side. Honestly, I don't hate the money line on San Diego State. If you're a little worried about it being close, I don't really love laying the price myself. But
could wait for the game live too.
Yeah, for sure. And, live betting is such a important part of college basketball. And I think it takes, it's a little bit of a different skill set, and you have to sort of understand that you're playing a bit of a different game. But, going against a run is never a bad way, in my opinion. Like if a team's just like going off and has the ball in their hands, like you bet against them, hope they miss their next shot, and the other team, gets a bucket, and it's a sort of a different ball game in terms of how the closing line math is kind of done there. But yeah, it's definitely not the worst idea. I think if you're waiting for like a plus money on San Diego State, we've seen them play very well late in these games. They've been able to go on these defensive runs. So I do think you would maybe be able to find a better price on San Diego State if you wait.
Yeah, tactically speaking, Dustin May versus Dutcher and Larinaga, who has gotten the best of Calvin Sampson and Rodney Terry, 2 top 15 defenses per KenPom, which UConn also factors into that metric, top 15, and has been pretty much all year, despite the little bit of bugaboo they had in their own right collectively, going back to the beginning of Big East play when teams were sagging off of Jackson, to the point that I was making with him as an individual factor. He was a liability for UConn, not only turnover-wise, but because teams weren't respecting his ability to space the floor, and he still doesn't do so at an efficient rate, but Hurley and the Huskies adjusted in that regard. It'll also be interesting to see player prop wise, Jordan Miller against Alex Karaban. Because Karaban also, when UConn was going through some of those woes at the start of Big East players, because opponents were taking advantage and more physical teams, especially teams that knew Hurley tactically, coaching wise, were trying to take advantage of Karaban in the low post. Zach Fremantle comes to mind in that, I believe, New Year's Eve game between Xavier and UConn at the Cintas Center. And if Jordan Miller, who's a very athletic four, can exploit Karaban, who's gotten better defensively, but I still think might be able to be had at that end of the floor, can space the floor very well, though. Just a comparison to Andre Jackson, we saw that, like I mentioned before the break, against Gonzaga. Now, really quickly here, Justin, before we get out of here, projected spreads for me for the national championship game. I have UConn as roughly a 4.5-point favorite against San Diego State. UConn, again, 7.5-ish versus FAU, Florida Atlantic. San Diego State, just about -1.5, maybe leaning towards 1.6, 1.7 versus the Canes. And this is, of course, before adjustments, but within the context of the sample we have, it wouldn't be a major adjustment unless we get some sort of injury coming into the championship game. Miami around the same spread against FAU, maybe closer to 2 rather than San Diego State being closer to 1.5 against the Canes. What say you when it comes to projected points?
Oh man, this is fun. So these projections are actually on the ShotQualityBets.com/March Madness site. We put up all 4 of the potential matchups, and no one's gotten in my DMs yet, so I don't know how many people have seen it, but I'll save the best one for last. We have FAU meeting Miami projected at 74-69. So Miami to win by 5. We have San Diego State, Miami projected at 70-65. So San Diego State winning that one around 68.5% for us. Florida Atlantic versus UConn, we're going to make around 8 points, 76.9% win percentage for UConn if they face FAU. And then UConn, San Diego State, we're actually going to have a 0.5-point edge to San Diego State, which might sound crazy, and it's a little nuts, but yeah, we do really like how they're going to match up. We think that, it's pretty much, they beat Alabama, right? So you can't sit there and say that their defense doesn't work, doesn't stifle the type of play that you see UConn wanting to go to in the threes. They have the defense to contend, and then their offense is going to come at them and try to play, in that rock fight. Like I said, the Aztecs love to play, but yeah, 52% chance for us that the Aztecs would win. Now, they have a little bit of a tougher matchup here against FAU than UConn does, but it should still be UConn. We make UConn to raise or to cut the nets around 42%. Market's a little bit higher, obviously, but that San Diego State game, man, should be a really good opportunity to take a plus money line if it is UConn San Diego State. Just on the principle, you're probably going to get value against UConn.
Yeah, I mentioned the potential hedge for me in the championship. It would definitely be the Aztecs. And I do think that game, even though my projections make it around 2 possessions, granted low 2 possessions at around 4.5, but I think that game would be close. Eerily similar to Butler and UConn in the 2011 national championship. Although I do think this game, if it is San Diego State and UConn, would be a slugfest, would be a low scoring game. Total would definitely correlate to that notion. So there might not be any, it might even be lower in the market. Who knows when you're talking about 2 top 10-ish defenses, and San Diego State being the 4th rated defense overall this season and number 1 over the last, I want to say, 2 months of college basketball. But that game, I don't think would be as, to your point, projection wise, and to my projection as well, I don't think it would be as big of a final score in terms of the scoring margin between UConn that we saw with UConn and Butler. I think this game would actually be tight. And we'll get into that game if it does happen, because this has been a very lengthy Final Four podcast, but a fun one. We've gotten into a ton of angles, which hopefully helps people not only when it comes to their spread and total bets and maybe in-game angles, which is very valuable, even though the limits might be a little lower at some books, but also player props and most outstanding player. A lot of different things covered here on the Outside Shots podcast. But Justin, before I wrap up, any closing words?
No, just a really appreciative of you having me on the show. Appreciate you, letting us talk a little bit about shot quality. The expected metric game is one of my personal favorites, regardless of if I work for the company. I mean, I was out here talking about SQ before I even joined. So, my passion runs deep about this stuff. I love sort of having this extra set of numbers that you can, use to go for or against, however you might want to use it. But it's just another important data set for evaluating the game of college basketball. And, I love getting up here and chatting about how we sort of see it and what it means to develop good offense instead of sort of just basing it on if shots go in or not. I mean, I was reading about, air density and the arcs of shots. So we could save that for the next time we hang out. But there's so much going on, and you definitely want to position yourself to make good decisions. And that's what shot quality is about.
No, it's an excellent resource for any bettor and college basketball fan for that matter. And before we get out of here, remember to head over to thelines.com and play.thelines.com in particular, as we're giving away $250 this Final Four weekend and a couple of contests. For more details, play.thelines.com. Subscribe to The Lines on Apple or Spotify. Your 5-star reviews and comments go a long ways to boost The Lines podcast, especially what we have going on college basketball wise. So if you're able to do so, would really appreciate it. For Justin Perri, follow him on Twitter at JustinPerri8. Follow ShotQuality as well on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at Eli Hershkovich. The Lines is over at The Lines US. Thanks for watching on YouTube and listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever you consume your favorite podcasts. So long, everybody.